Hey everybody, CrimsonCasts here. We're still digesting the patch notes, and this isn't going to be completely exhaustive, but I wanted to give you guys some updates about what's going to change for the leveling meta, and in particular the speed leveling and racing meta, but also applications to general leveling. There's a lot more to dive into, and there's a whole lot of math to do, and we expect more balance changes to come later this week, but here are the things that stood out to me on a first reading of the patch notes. One of the things that's most important to me is that we've actually found a lot of changes for very early leveling, meaning Acts 1 and 2. Notably, weapons are going to be a lot better in Act 1 than they previously were, for a variety of reasons that will vary with the weapon. But regardless of what weapon type you're using, a lot of undesirable modifiers, like accuracy and hybrid physical damage and accuracy, were moved to higher levels, which means that the chances that your very first Leaguestart Transmute and Augment get you desirable modifiers on your weapon is much higher, because your prefixes, your flat damage, your pure increased physical damage, that modifier pool is no longer diluted by these undesirable modifiers, which means that it's going to be much more consistent to get weapon-based runs to, say, level 10. And that's going to be a big deal on your Leaguestart. The second thing is that maces were substantively buffed in Act 1. A lot of people who may be familiar with sort of more advanced mace gameplay may find this particularly confusing, but Rolling Slam actually had a really important change, which is that it had its total attack time reduced by about half a second. And then this is going to sound like a nerf, but it is a buff in practice, which is that its damage got reduced. And what that means is the combination of Rolling Slam and Bone Shatter, you are less likely, if you end up with higher than normal damage, to kill enemies with your Rolling Slam. And that means that you can then use it more effectively to stun prime enemies for your Bone Shatters, which means that you're going to have a ton of better time clearing with your sort of mace-based clears in Act 1. And there's another change along these same lines that will help, which is that Brink 1 can now be cut as a level 1 support gem. Brink, if you're unfamiliar, is a support gem family that gives increased stun buildup, but prevents supported attacks from stunning enemies, which means for your sort of prime and payoff stun skills, like Rolling Slam plus Bone Shatter or Rend plus Wing Blast, you're going to be able to do a lot better at stun priming enemies in Act 1. So these reductions to damage actually improve the speed of your clear if you consider the combination of skills as a whole. So if you're watching Angormus, he's going to say the same thing. This is a de facto improvement to maces and to physical talismans, to melee-based talisman gameplay in Act 1. You'll notice that there are some changes just on sort of a similar theme here to Rend and Wing Blast. Rend was overscaling its damage as a function of gem level, and that got nerfed, but they increased the attack damage scaling. This is a bit hard to POB out, but I think that Rend at low levels is still going to be very good, especially because Wing Blast's Shockwave now deals 25% more damage than it used to, and it was already comfortably able to clear mobs in most of the campaign. While we're on the topic of Wyvern gameplay, I want to point out that Oil Barrage saw some substantive nerfs, mostly because it was like ridiculously galactically overtuned. Like in the races, we saw people kill Tavakai, who's a level 54 boss, using level 22 talismans, and that's not intended. So what they did was they increased its mana cost and decreased its duration. Its damage got rescaled. Long story short, I haven't POB'd it out, but essentially if you are leveling as Wyvern and you are not 20 levels under the area level like racers are, you're still going to be able to one-shot bosses, is my expectation. But we're going to look at the math for this more later this week. The next thing that I want to point out is that Shield Wall saw a bunch of changes, and it's a bit hard to disentangle this, so we're going to, again, be looking at this more substantively once we can get some Path of Building simulations together. But the basic idea is that Shield Wall itself had its damage scaling reduced as a function of shield armor, but we expect in the second half of the campaign, Acts 3, 4, and the interludes, that shields are going to have slightly higher base armor, because we've been told that armor and evasion items are getting base level buffs in general anyways. So what that means is that Shield Wall itself looks like it had mostly just a tuning change. There wasn't really anything substantive in terms of a buff or nerf. Its base damage got decreased, but the source of its damage got buffed, so essentially a wash. But Fortifying Cry, which is a huge portion of the build overall, is completely reworked, and I expect that in practice, this is a very substantive nerf to shield wall gameplay, especially in that second half of the campaign. What happens now is that Fortifying Cry shockwaves from a single shield wall cannot hit the same enemy multiple times. So if you look at this line now Fortifying Cry, which used to make up about 50% of your total damage in a shield wall build from level 31 onwards, is a much less substantive multiplier for your overall shield wall damage. And I expect, again, we're going to need to look at this in Path of Building, and we need to understand a little bit about how the skill geometry works, so there's going to need to be some testing early on in the league. My expectation is that shield wall is still playable if it's your favorite archetype, but it's not going to be dominantly better than other forms of warrior leveling. So if you like maces and shield wall, you now have a more balanced choice between the two, and shield wall will still be among the stronger options. But I think if you're someone who's interested in racing, based on my initial understanding of this, you're pretty likely to see that shield wall is no longer like rank 1 viable. I also think, just while we're on the topic of like top of meta leveling builds, Bonestorm is one of the most common options for boss killing on witches and other spellcasters, druid and sorceress as well. Bonestorm no longer has the sustain tag, and this affects the rate at which it crits and a bunch of other things. Its average damage is going to be the same. It's just going to have a much wider variance, crit versus non-crit. And that means that I think that a lot of people are worried at the ultra top end of what Bonestorm is going to lose out on, but I think that it's not going to be that substantive. And in fact, I think that this just means that it's still going to be better than other bossing skills for casters like Ember Fusillade. So I wouldn't be too worried if you're like an Essence Drain Bonestorm enjoyer. There's some changes to Living Lightning that may make it slightly harder at the margins, but I don't think you have too much to worry about. On the topic of leveling builds, though, there were a bunch of them that were essentially untouched. So there were literally no mentions to grenades. And of course, those weapon benefits where it's easier to get an Act 1 weapon are going to help grenade players get online sooner. Similarly, no changes to Essence Drain or Contagion, no changes to Twister yet, and neither of the plant skills, Entangle or Thrashing Vines, had any functional or damage changes. The star here, the stack that we control F, Thrashing Vines, and saw 1 out of 1, is just a wording clarification change on the tooltip. It doesn't actually change the base functionality of the skill. So long story short, about half of the top of meta leveling builds, plants, grenades, Essence Drain, Contagion, Twister, are in pretty similar places, and a couple of them saw some buffs early on and some tuning changes later on. So like Mace is good early, Shield Wall a little bit worse late. Looks like Talisman's better early, Oil Barrage a little bit worse late, but overall tuning changes. Couple of other things just about leveling builds. Looks like Lightning Arrow, Lightning Rod is playable but not buffed with mixed updates. One thing is that Lightning Arrow, multiple light beams are no longer able to chain onto the same target, so this is going to reduce your ability to activate your lightning rods against bosses. However, there were a number of bugs related in particular to like multi-shot support or surpassing chance to fire additional arrows that meant that you didn't place additional lightning rods, or that they would get placed awkwardly, or it just scaled weirdly with multi-prod stacking. And so now Lightning Rod has all those issues decrangled, but Lightning Arrow, the rate at which it will activate your lightning rods and therefore the ability for you to burst bosses down, especially early on in leveling as Lightning Arrow, Lightning Rod, may be a little bit worse. Exactly how this plays out is hard to simulate, and so again, this is one of those things that we're going to need to see in gameplay. Just know that if you're planning on leveling bows and you were previously torn between, say, Ice Shot and Snipe, Lightning Arrow, Lightning Rod appears to be like mildly nerfed on average, but it also appears to be like smoother to play and be a little bit less buggy, with some interactions for multi-projectile scaling for Lightning Rod. So like overall, unless you're like in love with the archetype or you feel extremely comfortable on it, I would say that it might be time to consider some other options if you're on the fence. Similar topic, by the way, Snipe appears to have been very mildly nerfed at low levels and do about the same damage at high levels. So if you were a big, freeze 'em and snipe 'em player, essentially the same damage that we were seeing before, about 8% less at low levels is what I was looking at from the tooltips. But again, this is Path of Building question. Huge W's for campaign quality of life in a number of different ways. One thing that's going to be important to you if you're a fan of racing or speedrunning or speed leveling is that the character limit for text search boxes got moved from 50 characters to 250 characters, which means that now you, if you're planning your own league start, or creators that you follow, if you're following a guide, are going to be able to write much more specific regexes, and that's going to be a huge deal in terms of improving your shopping efficiency. It also means that those of you who are crafters and might, for example, be transmuting and augmenting an entire tab of items in order to see what hits the good modifiers are going to be able to do regex things for bulk crafting much more efficiently. So that's kind of a niche use case. Other things for campaign quality of life, just while we're talking about it, you no longer need to visit Halani Gates in order to access Trader's Passage if you've already freed Risu, which means that you now are able to go through the Vastiri outskirts and then immediately go to Modern Mining Quarry and then proceed directly to Trader's Passage without having that awkward dialogue outside Halani Gates with Sekima Salas. So that saves, 20 seconds on your league start. But hey, it's 20 seconds. In a major win for casuals and a major L for both me and Angormus, the waterways levers in Motlin Waterways in Act 3 have been turned into pressure pads that you simply need to walk over, which means that you now no longer need to clear the mob and defend yourself while pulling the lever. So that should be a W for people who either have really fast clear or have really bad clear. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out in races, but long story short, it feels like it's declunked it a lot for casual league starters, and that for speedrunners, it's going to be some kind of a change. I'll be interested to see how it plays out, because full clearing waterways was a standard part of the leveling strategy in the XP curve. Speaking of the leveling strategy in the XP curve, I'm baffled by this change, and I'm curious for you guys to give me your thoughts in the comment. Monster density in the second half of the campaign has been reduced, especially in the interludes, to allow getting through the areas more quickly. I can think of several zones where I did feel that density was quite high. For example, Utsal is quite difficult to get to, or Drowned City in some circumstances, Apex of Filth sometimes. There are a couple of places in Act 4 where density could be a little bit overwhelming, the Abandoned Prison, for example. But in general, throughout the interludes and in general throughout the second half of the campaign, I didn't think that, other than a couple of high spots, that there was too much monster density. And in fact, I felt that it was quite difficult to stay on leveling curve if you're making efficient movement progress through those zones. So seeing reductions in monster density may mean that I'm less overwhelmed, especially defensively. But it also may mean that it's a little bit harder to stay on the XP curve at those points in the campaign, unless monster XP yield has been improved in those places. This is part of a trend that I've actually seen in the transition from 0.3 to 0.4, and then again now from 0.4 to 0.5, where monster density has been reduced because we had Abyss League, which added a huge amount of density. And then that got taken away and replaced with Fate of the Vol, which had less density, and so it became harder for people in speed leveling circumstances to stay on XP curve, especially in Acts 3 and 4. And then now maybe it turns out that Runes of Alder, because it's a wave-based thing, there's going to be much more magic pack density if you interact with the League mechanic to stay on XP curve. So I'm baffled right now, but we'll see how it plays out in practice. There are a bunch of tuning changes that could have happened behind the scenes that could have changed this. So that's sort of it for leveling changes. Overall, the leveling meta hasn't been shaken up too much, especially because grenades, Essence Ring Contagion, plants, twisters haven't been changed that much. And there have been tuning changes to things like mace leveling and shield wall that don't really concern me too much. I think a shield wall player is still going to have a plenty comfortable time, especially in SSF or in hardcore, where it's desirable to carry a big shield anyways. And I think that a lot of melee talisman gameplay is going to be buffed, especially early on. Regarding changes for day one and early mapping, I'm particularly interested in the mercenary ascendancy changes, so I'll talk about that first. And that is that Witch Hunter is slightly nerfed, maybe? Hard to figure out. Obsessive Rituals, which is the ascendancy point that grants you Sorcery Ward, now gives 50% less armor and evasion instead of 35% less. So you're taking a pretty substantive hit to your armor and evasion. That said, the amount of armor and evasion granted by early mapping item bases has been buffed pretty dramatically. They say that, for example, at level 65, you should expect to have 33% more armor or 33% more evasion compared to previous patches, and that you will see that tapering down to 15% at level 80 plus, which means if you compare Sorcery Ward gaming at, say, early mapping tiers when you're wearing level 65 items, the effective change is that you actually have 2% more armor and evasion than you did in previous cases. And in the late mapping circumstance, when you're wearing level 80 bases, it looks like you'll have about 88.5% as much. Again, very naive simulations. We'll see how this changes because it's hard to know without knowing what the changes to crafting are going to do or what the trade economy is going to be like, exactly what this is. But in general, it seems like a very slight nerf at the ultra high end, which for Sorcery Ward doesn't really matter because Sorcery Ward, at that point, it's pretty easy to get to, say, 8,000 Sorcery Ward on 70% evasion, and so I'm not too worried about that, and it appears to be roughly the same in early mapping. Another variable that's pretty important here is that they changed the deflection formula, so if you were considering going evasion deflection and letting Sorcery Ward carry you on your like max hit pool, which is something that pure evasion would struggle with otherwise, the formula for deflect got changed, and again, with very naive simulations, comparing the old and the new formula, the old formula is the yellow goldenrod line here, and the dark blue line is the new formula, which means that like during leveling, deflection is going to be a little bit worse at low investment than it previously was. But once you get to that 15 to 20,000 evasion deflection rating amount, which is pretty achievable in low maps, or especially in trade economy, it's going to be about the same, and at very high investment, 30k evasion, 40k evasion, it's going to be substantively better. Like your deflection chance is going to be 85% instead of 70%. So that's a big deal. It also means that the effect of blind, if that's something, if you're playing on, for example, the monk tree, or if you're playing in portions of the mercenary tree, it looks like evasion deflection is going to get a lot more benefit from blind than it previously did, just in terms of your percent increased chance to deflect things. And so that just means that like overall we see some nerfs at the high end, but it also looks like deflection is better, and also the nerfs aren't at a part where Sorcery Ward struggles anyway. So it looks like it might be a nothing burger. It's hard to figure out essentially what the scaling is, but I think if you were interested in playing Sorcery Ward, you're going to be fine. And you know, there are changes to chase uniques like High Resire, but long story short, you're going to be fine, because by the time you get to having a High Resire, you're comfortable. Regarding other changes to Mercenary Ascendancies, we still don't know what Gemling like does. We know that it provides alternate quality to a bunch of different skills, but we don't know what that alternate quality is for essentially any skill. For example, the basic quality on grenades provides grenade cooldown recovery rate, which is somewhat valuable, but it also looks like perhaps Gemling Legionnaire could provide chance for grenades to activate multiple times, or grenade AoE, or a variety of other things, chance to inflict ailments that could be really useful for grenades, among many other archetypes that you can play on Mercenary. You can play bows on Mercenary, you can play melee Mercenary. And so it's hard to figure out exactly what Gemling does since we lack that information. Overall, I would say if you're interested in playing Mercenary this patch, that it looks like Witch Hunter will still be very strong, and once we get more information about Gemling quality, depending on what particular skill archetype you're interested in, it turns out that Gemling may be viable now, especially because Gemling as an ascendancy provides a lot of access to reduced movement penalty from using skills while moving, and that means that it actually competes with Pathfinder in terms of its ability to like move, other than its lack of ability to sprint knockdown. By the way, just while we're thinking about things, the Essence of Virtue that provides the sort of like gem-studded barrier, if you had nothing but evasion skills on, you would have 18 motes from that and 3 base motes. So you'd have 21 emerald motes, and that provides 105% increased armor and evasion, which is not very strong. Typically you can get, say, 400, 450% increased evasion on tree already. We're also expecting some more changes to armor evasion hybrid on tree that we can see later in the week. Mark said that he was going to work on that. We didn't see it in the patch notes. Maybe it's coming in a tuning change that'll be announced after this initial patch notes announcement. But in any case, it looks like if you're interested in that aspect of Gemling, that you may be more interested in looking at scaling through the increased life, increased mana regen, those sorts of things that may be more interesting to you. I would say that defensively, Essence of Virtue doesn't appear to me to be at least that strong. Speaking of changes to defenses, it's been an absolute bloodbath for ES recharge rate. If you control F, faster start of energy shield recharge, there are 19 references to it in the patch note, and all of them are nerfs, which means that the base delay before your energy shield starts recharging is really long, and that means that you're still going to be able to scale your max hit sky high for the most part. There have been some changes to energy shield scaling overall, but we've seen a huge number of buffs, especially in early mapping for armor and evasion, and it looks like we've seen a bloodbath for ES recharge mechanics, and so as a consequence, you're going to struggle a little bit more, especially earlier on. At high investment, you'll still be fine. One thing that I do want to point out, though, is that that means that ascendancies that do provide benefits here are comparatively much more valuable than before. Of course, everyone's interested in the Chronomancer changes, where you can get 30% global damage reduction, and you have a bunch of tools for active defense. But even something like the Disciple of Varashta has a single point ascend for the 4th teaching, and that provides -1 second to base ES recharge delay, which is a huge benefit when all the other mechanics to make your ES recharge start sooner have been completely gutted, like just absolutely eviscerated. So as a consequence, comparatively, the 4th teaching is going to be a much stronger node. Similarly for a couple of nodes for Lich and Abyssal Lich. But I just wanted to call out, if you're interested in ES gameplay, you may want to consider how your ascendancy affects your defensive choices, especially on day 1, day 2, day 3 of the league. So that's just something to point out, like ES recharge rate got changed a whole lot. Leech, by the way, as a mechanic, got completely annihilated. This makes life-based casters have much harder time surviving. Essentially, there's a cap on the amount of damage that can apply to a single instance of Leech. That's at 40,000. And that means that if you're doing something like, say, casting a Spark Blood Mage, where you're spending a huge amount of life, but you're dealing many small hits, only one of those hits is going to provide Leech to you anyways. So as a consequence, like attack speed stacking life-based casters are going to have a little bit harder time to survive. At high investment, you'll be fine again once you can get mechanisms to increase your percentage Leech. And there have been buffs actually in the Blood Mage Ascendancy to the base amount of life Leech from spells that you have. But it does mean that you will need to get to higher investment before Blood Mage returns to its previous level of survivability. And Blood Mage is, for the most part, going to stay about as strong as it was offensively, though there have been some changes to chase uniques, but by the time that you have chase uniques on your cast on crit, Spark, Comet, Blood Mage, you're clearing everything anyways, so I think you'll survive if your Wrathpith is a little bit weaker than before. So these are just like my first day 1 takeaways. We don't have a whole lot of notes yet, but in general, I think that the leveling meta is going to change in terms of how it'll affect races. I don't know. My particular Leaguestart plans, I'm now a little bit more torn than I was before. I was pretty confident I was going to start Witch Hunter, but after seeing that there were no changes or nerfs to Abyssal Lich, I'm considering leveling up on Abyssal Lich and playing Abyssal Lich Twisters, because Twister didn't get nerfed either. I'm still mostly in the camp of playing Witch Hunter to start, because I think Sorcery Ward remains very strong, especially at high investment. Looks like ES got nerfed a whole lot. Looks like Act 1 progression is going to be a lot smoother. The other thing to say is that in the patch notes, they said that there are a lot more essences, especially in Act 2, which means that, again, after you see the modifier pool for Act 1 items change so dramatically, you're going to see changes in Act 2 to your ability to grab essences and craft those upgrades to continue your progression quite quickly. So I think that the first half of the campaign item variation is smoothed out quite substantively. We'll need to see how substantive it is in practice, because we don't know how many more essences we're going to get or where exactly they're going to be. I am very glad to see that they put in a note that they are reducing the spawn rate of essences of the infinite, which provide base stats, and that means you're much more likely to get, you know, your resistance essences or your damage essences, and those are the ones that you're really interested in. So overall, I think that the patch notes do some interesting things to balance. They don't go nearly as far as I would have liked to see them go. I would still like to see some changes to grenade scaling to make it weaker early and stronger in mapping. I would like to see some changes to Essence Drain Contagion, especially super early on. I feel that Essence Drain Contagion is quite strong, but it tends to fall off in maps, and so I'd like to see some adjustments there. Perhaps to its area of effect could scale with quality or something like that, where you can get back up to that previous level. But long story short, campaign balance doesn't seem too changed. It seems that most of the changes are tuning changes and things that smooth out your ability to progress through the campaign. And it looks like the number 1 W that we've taken are mostly in quality of life things. Things like you no longer need to visit the Lani Gates. Waterways are now a lever. Act 3 has been are now no longer a lever, and you just need to step on pressure pads. It looks like the reorganization of Act 3 zones and the consolidation of Act 2 zones are going to be a big W. We will need to see if the monster density changes feel good or bad. I think that that will make it a lot. It will make it feel that you're able to progress through those zones a lot more quickly. And then, of course, like absolutely galactic W for regex gameplay, because character limit has been literally quintupled. So as a consequence, you're going to see like a huge amount of improvement in your ability to like sort through vendors and so forth. So I'll be live on Twitch tomorrow at twitch.tv/CrimsonCasts for you guys to come hang out while we work on Leaguestart planners. I'm definitely going to keep working on my Lightning Convert, Valako's Vice, Witch Hunter grenade play, and I may also cook up some Abyssal Lich planner or some Sorceress planner, although the ES changes have me a little bit wary of that. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments down below, but the best way to get a hold of me is in my Twitch chat, and I'll see you later.